to another in our series of Webequie Supply Road live streaming sessions. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'll be your host again for this session. This is the last in a series of sessions focusing on preliminary observations from the baseline studies and other topics such as the one today, cumulative effects, that will be of interest to our viewers and listeners. Just to remind everyone, the intent of these shows is to keep community members and the general public up to date with the environmental assessment as it progresses. We hope that these sessions will encourage open, thoughtful, and informed discussion that will make the EA as comprehensive as possible. And just to remind everyone, this is a call-in show, so you're free to call in with a comment or question about the project. The number is 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. So, today's topic, cumulative effects, an explanation and illustration. So what I'm going to try to do today is give you a pretty good idea of what cumulative effects are and talk about the cumulative effects assessment for the Webequie Supply Road project. So let's kick things off and talk a bit about what cumulative effects are. And as you can see on your screen, the definition of cumulative effects, and this is a good one, is changes to the environment from the project in combination with other past, present, and future physical activities. So it's not just our project, it's our project plus impacts from past projects that are finished now, current projects that are still going, and projects that we can reasonably see happening in the future. That's basically what it is. And let's talk a little bit now about what cumulative means. So I've got we'll get a picture on your screen here. This is a picture I found on the interweb, and in this picture, you're showing multiple environmental effects. So um, you've got exhaust coming from buildings and factories and things like that. You've got, so those are air emissions. You've got exhaust coming or air emissions coming from vehicles. You've probably got fluid leaking from vehicles onto the roadway and then being washed away in rain events. And when that water runs off, it can go into storm sewers, which can end up being emptying into the local water course, as is happening here. You could have fertilizer on the green air on the grassy areas, excess fertilizer running off. It's not absorbed by the by the grass and by the soil. It would run off into the storm sewers and then get emptied into the water course, the receiving water course. And then you can see also in this image um, basically trash, different types of garbage, plastic bottles, things that won't necessarily break down, or when they break down, they don't break down into something that's particularly good for the environment. So when you take all of that together, it all accumulates. So that's where we get the word cumulative from to give everybody just a bit of an idea. And maybe now we can talk a little bit about cumulative effects and what these are. So if we can move to the next slide. Okay, here we are. So let's look at examples of cumulative effects. So let's take fish habitat, for example. You might have destruction of fish habitat um, from multiple activities, whether they could be um, effluent from in industrial processes, so wastewater being dumped into the local river or stream, changing the chemistry of the water, introducing contaminants which can affect the habitat and the health of fish. There could be that. Um, uh, there could be um, other things such as like oily runoff into the watercourse from, as I mentioned, on roads, changing again the chemistry of the water. There could be um, garbage being emptied into the water course, causing damage to habitat areas. There could be, like I said, dumped garbage, things like that. Another example might be shoreline destruction from multiple physical activities. For example, sometimes to increase land base, there might be filling of lakes or creeks, sometime to gain more land or for erosion and erosion control for shoreline protection. All of that has effects. Sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's more permanent. Construction has effects. In water construction, such as uh, building bridges, putting in piers for bridges, supports for bridges. That has an impact. Typically, it's just a localized impact and it's a temporary impact during construction. But if it's not done properly, just like any shoreline related work, if it's construction work is not done properly, you can get erosion of the shoreline, runoff of soil into the watercourse, affecting the clarity of the water, the turbidity of the water, and then affecting the habitat and then fish in general and their ability to thrive. Other examples of cumulative effects would be damage caused to areas that are important to Indigenous community members, such as spiritual sites, um, burial sites, sites where community members go as families or clans. They go on a regular basis to. All these places are very important and sacred to community members, and that's why it's important, during projects such as the Webequie Supply Road project, um, environmental assessment, that this information be shared with the technical team to make sure that that road will not disturb these sacred areas. So that's there are numbers of examples of cumulative effects. Another one could be archaeological sites, right? Disturbance of archaeological sites that might be encountered during road construction. So all these things together, create basically accumulate and have cumulative effects. So you have to take all of these together, and I'm going to get into very shortly a description of in different ways of what cumulative effects are. And now, just to remind everyone again that this is a call-in show. You're free to call in with a comment or question at 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. As you can see on your screen, you can get us on social media, Facebook, YouTube as well. And so let's now move on to the different types of cumulative effects, because there are different types. And the words are big, describing the cumulative effects, but it's really not that complicated. So um, there's additive cumulative effects. So imagine just simple math. 1 + 1 = 2. You take one effect, you add it to another effect, and you get the sum of the two effects. That's an additive cumulative effect. Now we move into something which is a little bit different. It's called synergistic cumulative effect. And the best way I can describe that is 1 + 1 = 3, or anything more than 2. So when two or more effects interact to create a cumulative effect that is greater than or otherwise different from the simple addition of those effects. So that's a synergistic cumulative effect. We also then have something called compensatory cumulative effects. And that's when two effects from two or more physical activities actually offset each other or cancel each other out. So you have one effect, and then you have another effect that cancels that one out. And then we have another one, which is an interesting one. It's called a masking cumulative effect, and this one's a little bit trickier. It's where the effects from one or more physical activity basically covers or disguises or masks the effect of another physical activity. So there's a lot. There's four different basic kinds of cumulative effects that we're looking at, and it's important to sort of keep these in mind. Again, cumulative effects is a topic that it's a bit mysterious to people, and part of it is because you're looking at you're trying to predict things um, into the future, and I'll get into why or how it is we're doing that in a second. But because you're looking at not only your own project, like the WSR Webequie Supply Road project, and looking at the impacts of that project, the net environmental impacts of that project, but you're looking at all the other projects in the area from the past that are currently operating. And then you're looking at projects in the future that it's reasonable enough to think they might actually occur. So it's a little tricky. It's a little bit abstract, I guess, is the word for it to describe um, when what I mean by cumulative impacts or cumulative assessment. And I think probably the best way to describe it, and I know this sounds crazy because I'm involving math now, and you think, how is that going to make it any easier? But there is a math-based explanation which I think should help make things quite clear. So, for example, let's look at Webequie Supply Road, potential project effects. So we go through the environmental assessment, we identify potential project effects associated with the Webequie Supply Road project. Then we look at the mitigation of those project effects. So what is mitigation again? Mitigation is a way of is eliminating or reducing effects. Mitigation, that's a big word. So you have the potential project effects from WSR, from the Webequie Supply Road project. Then you have ways that you can reduce or eliminate those effects. And when you subtract the mitigation from the potential effects, you end up with what's called residual project effects. Residual meaning leftover, remaining project effects. So those would be the leftover effects of the Webequie Supply Road project. But because we're talking about cumulative effects of the project, we have to look at other projects in the area. So we look at we take those residual project effects from WSR, we add them then to the residual project effects identified from past projects. So projects that are finished now, maybe a mine site that's now closed, any leftover or residual project effects of that combined with projects from that are currently operating, present projects, and then combined with projects um, from reasonably foreseeable projects and activities. So future projects, they aren't built yet. They haven't even, in many cases, they may not even have an environmental assessment yet, but we have enough of an understanding of them to a degree, and they are reasonable enough to be possible in the future. So we take those leftover effects from WSR, we add them to the leftover effects from past, present, and future projects, add them together, you get potential cumulative effects. So the combination of the two, you get potential cumulative effects. But we're not done there. So once we've identified those potential cumulative effects, we can still mitigate. We can still do additional mitigation methods to reduce those effects. So that we end up taking whatever mitigation of reduction or elimination and subtracting that from the potential cumulative effects. And we end up with the final result, which is the residual cumulative effects. So the effects left over after looking at not only the WSR, but all the past, present, and future, reasonably foreseeable future projects. So that's sort of the explanation of, of cumulative effects using math. And I think that that one works pretty well, I would say. So you may then be asking, what types of projects would be part of a cumulative effects assessment? Well, the actual specific projects are listed in our terms of reference for the project. The Ring of Fire is an area that has been targeted by the development by Ontario due to mining potential. It's of interest to Indigenous communities because of the potential for it to transform communities economically and allow them to grow and develop economically as well too. Um, so this is an area of great interest. There are a lot of projects planned because there has been a fair amount of exploration done in the area, indicating that this is a mineral rich area. And so as a result of that, there have been projects proposed to enough level of detail where we can provide some indication as potential effects of those projects. So these would be the reasonably foreseeable or future projects that we would include in our cumulative effects. And of course, we also know about other projects in the area that have occurred, past projects, whether they're mining projects or forestry projects or dam projects. We have identified those past ones, and then there are projects that are currently in operation, and they all have residual environmental effects. So we have to look at all of these together. Um, Now, it's not all mining, these potential future projects. They could be exploration associated with further resource development or mining. Could be, well, in our case, road construction, infrastructure construction, such as the Martin Falls Community Access Road and Northern Road Link, as well as the Webequie Supply Road project. Could be other utilities and associated infrastructure to support mine development, such as power lines, power transmission lines. All these all these things together constitute the projects that we consider as part of a cumulative effects assessment. So, study plan, cumulative effects study plan. Um, as with other studies being conducted as part of this environmental assessment, the fisheries or fish and fish habitat studies, the groundwater studies, the surface water studies, all the different studies that make up an environmental assessment, a study plan has been prepared for cumulative effects for the WSR project. And so you may be asking, what is a study plan? Well, a study plan is a detailed description, a more detailed description than is in the terms of reference as to how does a specific study will be done. And as I said, I think we've produced uh, 17 or 18 of these different study plans as part of the environmental assessment. And these study plans, as I mentioned, go into more detail than is in the terms of reference. The terms of reference is the work plan for the environmental assessment. These study plans go into more detail, talk about one particular study and how it's going to be undertaken. So let's talk a little bit now about the contents of the cumulative effects study plan. Um, and I think in doing that, I think we need to talk a bit about valued components again. And we've talked about valued components in previous shows. It's an important concept. It's an important thing to know about because you'll hear this word a lot. Just like mitigation, you hear the term valued components quite a bit. So valued components are components of the environment that are considered to have economic, social, biological, conservation, aesthetic, or cultural value to Indigenous groups, the public, federal and provincial authorities, and interested parties, and have the potential for change as a result of the project. So these are important things to community members, to the general public. Very important things that could change as a result of the project. Important thing to remember. So let's give you a couple of examples of valued components. Fish and fish habitat, for example. The criteria associated with fish and fish habitat. So the things to study. Well, what we call indicator species, brook trout, northern pike, walleye, lake sturgeon, species of fish that community members rely on, that have importance to community members to sustain them for food or medicine in some cases. And then the indicators, the measuring, the ways to measure impacts. We would look at things like habitat availability. Habitat availability is defined as quantity and quality. Habitat quantity and quality. So would the road have impacts on the amount of fish habitat? What areas would be impacted? What is that as a percentage of the total of the total project area? Um, Abundance. So how many fish are caught, for example? How many fish are out there? And distribution. So where is a particular fish species found? These are all indicators. These are ways of measuring impacts on VCs, such as fish and fish habitat. Another example would be wildlife. Um, with wildlife, the associated criteria could be moose or the American marten or bats. The indicators or measuring tools would be habitat availability and distribution, survival and reproduction, abundance and distribution, species habitat specificity. So, what specific types of habitat do species require at maybe at different stages of life, whether it's breeding or rearing their young, things like that. Predation and habitat usage, cultural significance or importance. All these indicators are ways of measuring impacts associated with wildlife, for example. So let's move now, because time's running out. Let's move now to talk a little bit about the steps in the cumulative effects assessment. So there's four main steps. The first one is called scoping. And that's sort of looking at things, at a high level and figuring out, okay, what are we going to do? Followed by that, you have analysis. Then you have mitigation. Then you have determination of significance. Then you have follow-up programs. So I'm going to go into each one of these in a little bit more detail. The scoping, that step involves identifying those valued components for which residual or leftover or net environmental effects, all those things mean the same thing. Residual, leftover, net environmental effects. So you have potential effects minus, like subtracting mitigation, you're left with residual or net or leftover effects. So identifying VCs for which residual or net environmental effects are expected. Um, Determining the spatial, so spatial meaning land and water area, geographic area, and temporal meaning time, over what period of time, applicable to the valued components, and identifying physical activities, including other projects which may interact with the Webequie Supply Road project residual effects within the identified boundaries. So again, going back to what I was talking about, we identify the residual effects from the WSR project, we combine them with the same from past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future projects. Next comes analysis, and the analysis is done to determine how the physical activities or projects identified in the scoping stage affect the valued components carried forward from the scoping stage within the determined, so within those time boundaries and those space boundaries, within those geographic land and water boundaries. So that's the analysis step. And then finally, mitigation, or not finally, but the next step is mitigation. And again, mitigation is to eliminate. So once we look at the environmental effects from the different projects, we look at, okay, mitigation. How can we eliminate, reduce, or control adverse, meaning negative or bad, leftover effects? Next is determination of significance of any remaining bad or negative or adverse residual leftover effects after mitigation. So how significant are these effects? And then finally, the final stage in the cumulative effects assessment is follow-up programs as necessary to address these cumulative effects. You've identified them. What kind of follow-up programs can be done to verify the accuracy of the environmental assessment and determine the effectiveness of those mitigation of impact reduction measures? And this is something that is not always realized um, by the general public, by community members, that when an environmental assessment is completed and if it's approved, that doesn't mean everything stops then and the project just goes ahead. There's typically a lot of follow-up monitoring that's done both during construction and post-construction, sometimes for a defined period of time, sometimes for, in some cases, it can go on for extremely long periods of time to make sure that there are no further impacts, and to make sure that that environmental assessment was done properly, and that there's no surprises. So that is something to keep in mind. Monitoring programs are typically something that come out of an environmental assessment, and they involve checking that environmental assessment and making sure that it was accurate and taking action where necessary if things come up, negative things come up that need to be managed or dealt with. So those are basically the steps in the cumulative effects assessment. So before I wrap things up, I just want to do a quick summary for everyone of what cumulative effects are. They are changes to the environment from the project in combination with other past, present, and future physical activities. They're a combination of the leftover effects, the one meaning the ones that can't be mitigated or minimized or eliminated from the project, combined with the leftover effects from the past, present, or reasonably foreseeable future projects, minus any mitigation that can be done for cumulative effects. So that is our summary for you right there. I hope this was clear to everyone. I hope it makes a lot of sense. Um, I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to our streaming sessions over the last few months. We're going to continue these again in the new year with a different set of topics. If you have topics to suggest to us, we welcome that. Um, you can contact us at any time with those topic suggestions, and we'll run with that and put together some shows. And again, please don't hesitate to contact us about the project. And I just want to remind Indigenous communities and the general public that they can engage with the project team in a number of ways, whatever suits them best. It could be consultation and engagement options, could include focus group sessions, community sessions, drop-in sessions, virtual focus groups, virtual community presentations, 1 hour teleconferences, local radio show call-in shows where we can go to your community and uh, and and broadcast over your local radio station, and then online surveys. So there's lots of different ways to contact us and engage and consult with the project team. We're here to spread information, to talk with you if you have concerns. We're here for lots of different reasons. So we hope you'll join us again in the new year. And again, we'll be back with all kinds of interesting topics. And miigwech for joining us. Have a Merry Christmas, and we will see you in the new year.